The road from Galilee takes 3 days on foot, through limestone hills, through scrub and heat and silence, down into the Jordan Valley, then back up into the Judean highlands. The final ascent is the hardest, and then the valley breaks open and the ridge fills the horizon. Below, a dense grid of rooftops, smoke rising from 100,000 cooking fires, the noise of a city beginning its morning. But above all of it, above the markets and the neighborhoods and the packed lower terraces, an artificial mountain. Herod's engineers had expanded the natural hill, faced its slopes in massive ashlar blocks, and built an esplanade covering 36 acres. On top of that platform, in white marble and gold, stood the temple. Ancient writers say that when the morning sun struck it fully, travelers still miles from the city had to shield their eyes, that from a distance it looked like a mountain covered in snow. This is Jerusalem in the 1st century AD, and it is operating at the absolute edge of its tensions. This is Bible Stories Unearthed, where we retell the narratives of Scripture alongside the history, archaeology, and ancient world that give them their full weight. Today, using decades of excavation beneath modern Jerusalem, we will explore a reconstruction of exactly what the city looked like, sounded like, and felt like during the life of Jesus. By the time Jesus walked its streets, Jerusalem had been a sacred city for 1,000 years, and everything visible suggested it knew it. It sat on a series of limestone ridges in the Judean highlands, enclosed by natural geography on 3 sides. The Kidron Valley ran deep to the east. The Hinnom Valley curved below to the south and west. Between the upper and lower parts of the city ran the Tyro-Peon Valley, the Valley of the Cheesemakers, a natural divide that shaped every street plan and neighborhood boundary. The Jerusalem of the 1st century AD was not the Jerusalem of David or Solomon. Almost everything a visitor would have seen had been built, rebuilt, or dramatically expanded by one man, Herod the Great, Rome's client king over Judea from 37 to 4 BC. Herod was an obsessive builder on a scale that had almost no parallel in the ancient Near East. He constructed a port city at Caesarea Maritima. He built fortified palaces at Masada, Jericho, and the artificial mountain of Herodium. But Jerusalem was his greatest project, a transformation that consumed the last decades of his reign and continued under his successors for generations after his death. After Herod died in 4 BC, Judea passed through a series of political arrangements before becoming a Roman province administered by prefects. Pontius Pilate held that position from 26 to 36 AD. The city he governed was still, in many places, an active construction site. It would not be finished for another generation. Let's walk in from the south. The permanent population of Jerusalem in this period is estimated by modern scholars, cautiously, at somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people. At the 3 great pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, that number swelled as Jewish communities from across Judea and the wider diaspora converged on the city. Families from the Galilee, merchants from Alexandria, communities from Babylonia and from Rome itself. The roads into the city filled with people, animals, and Roman soldiers watching the whole operation with practiced wariness. If you arrived from the south, from Bethlehem, from Hebron, from the desert roads, you would eventually join a broad paved thoroughfare that climbed northward through the heart of the city from the Pool of Siloam all the way to the southern face of the Temple Mount. Archaeologists call it the Pilgrims Road. Excavations led by Ronnie Reich and Eli Shukran, beginning in the early 2000s, revealed its full extent. Original Herodian stone paving, drainage channels running beneath, a street wide enough to absorb the dense festival crowds that used it every year. At the top of that road, where the Great Staircase met the southern gates, Benjamin Mazar's excavations, begun in 1968 and continuing for more than a decade, uncovered the monumental southern steps themselves, still largely intact after 2,000 years. And clustered at their base, the excavations found something that says more about this city than almost any inscription could. Mikva'ot, ritual immersion pools. Dozens of them hewn directly into the bedrock at the very threshold of the temple courts. Jewish law required purification before entering, a full immersion in naturally gathered water. The presence of so many pools at precisely this location tells us something essential about Jerusalem's organizing logic. But here is what makes this city genuinely complex. That religious logic existed in direct, visible tension with another kind of logic entirely. Looming over the same courts from the northwest stood the Antonia Fortress, Rome's garrison position, from which soldiers could look straight down into the temple precincts below. During pilgrimage festivals, additional troops were stationed along its walls. Herod's own vast palace fortress occupied the western ridge, its three towers, named Hippicus, Phasael, and Mariamne, visible from across the city and for miles beyond it. Jerusalem was organized around holiness. It was simultaneously organized around control. Those two facts occupied the same skyline every single day. Now look up at the mount itself. The Temple Mount was Herod's most audacious achievement. The original hill, Mount Moriah, was not large enough for what he intended, so he expanded it. He extended the platform on all four sides, retaining the slopes with massive walls, filling in the natural valleys with earth and vaulted substructures, and creating an artificial esplanade covering roughly 36 acres. The stones used in those retaining walls are still visible today, and they are staggering. A single stone in the western wall measures approximately 14 meters long and is estimated to weigh around 570 tons. It was placed there by human hands. The western wall itself is important to identify correctly. It is not a wall of the temple. It is the western retaining wall of the platform on which the temple stood. The temple building rose inside the esplanade, well above the level of the street. What we see when we look at the western wall is the outer skin of the enormous artificial mountain Herod constructed to hold the whole project up. At the top of the southern approaches, you entered the outer court, the court of the Gentiles. An enormous open plaza, accessible to anyone regardless of their faith. Along the southern wall ran the royal stoa, a vast pillared hall, 4 rows of columns deep, stretching nearly the full length of the mount. Josephus describes it as one of the finest structures in the known world. It functioned as a meeting place, a public hall, a place of teaching, and, as the Gospels record, the location of the money changers and the sellers of animals for sacrifice. Deeper into the complex, access narrowed. Between the outer court and the inner precincts stood a low stone barrier, the soreg, with inscriptions in both Greek and Latin warning non-Jews that passage beyond this point was forbidden under penalty of death. Those inscriptions are not legendary. A complete example found in 1871 is preserved in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. A partial fragment discovered near the Lion's Gate in 1935 is held in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. They say precisely what Josephus described. Beyond the soreg, the court of women, open to all Jewish worshippers. Beyond that, the court of Israel for Jewish men. Beyond that, the court of the priests, where the sacrifices and the altar stood. And at the center of everything, the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies. A room entered once a year by one person, the high priest, on Yom Kippur. The temple building itself was faced in white marble and gold, and when the morning sun struck it fully, Josephus writes, it looked from a distance like a mountain covered in snow. Now step back from the mount and look at the city pressed against either side of the valley below. On the higher western ridge, above the Tyropean Valley, lived the Jerusalem elite, priestly families, senior merchants, those whose wealth and status were bound up directly with the temple economy. And the gap between that ridge and the crowded terraces below it was not merely geographical, it was visible, material, and, as later events would prove, politically volatile. Naaman Avigad's excavations in the Jewish quarter from 1969 to 1982 uncovered a series of first-century mansions beneath the debris left by the Roman destruction. Mosaic floors, frescoed walls in Roman style, elaborate private mikvahot, stone vessels in abundance, the household contents of people wealthy enough to furnish their lives in the idiom of the wider Mediterranean world while keeping their domestic practice entirely within Jewish law. From those hilltop residences, the dense, smoky grid of the lower city and the Tyropean below would have been permanently visible. These were not simply comfortable homes. They were elevated positions in every sense. One of those mansions was destroyed in 70 AD when Rome suppressed the Jewish revolt and burned the city. Avigad called it the burnt house. Inside, excavators found a stone weight bearing an Aramaic inscription, Bar Kathros, a priestly family name that appears in later rabbinic sources, remembered there with something less than affection. Near the entrance to the house, they found the skeletal arm of a young woman, apparently caught in the fire as she tried to reach the door. The distance between the rarefied world of that house and the terrible ordinariness of that death is almost impossible to hold in your mind simultaneously. And yet that is what the archaeology asks you to do. Below, in the lower city and the Tyropean Valley, the texture changed sharply. Markets ran along the main colonnaded streets. Bakers, butchers, tanners, and cloth merchants filled the lower terraces in packed rows. The city was supplied by an aqueduct system initiated during the Hasmonean period and expanded across subsequent generations, drawing water from springs in the Hebron Hills into an extensive network of rock-cut cisterns throughout the city. Near the northern end of the city, the Gospels mention the Pool of Bethesda with its 5 porticos, and near the southern end, the Pool of Siloam. Both have been excavated. The Pool of Bethesda, once treated skeptically by some scholars as a theological symbol rather than a physical location, proved to be a real, identifiable site whose physical remains match the Gospel's description closely. The Pool of Siloam was documented more precisely through Reich and Shukran's excavations from 2004 onward, which uncovered a large Herodian period stepped pool at the base of the Pilgrims' Road, the very street that carried the city's festival crowds from the water northward toward the Temple Mount. And threading through all of it, in the garrison on the fortress walls, in the prefect's residence, in the soldiers moving through the crowds, was the permanent fact of Roman occupation. The city lived with that fact every day. And in the week the Gospels moved toward as their climax, every layer of that city, the temple, the priests, the crowd, the prefect, the garrison, would press against every other layer at once. The archaeology of Jerusalem has advanced more rapidly since 1967 than in any previous period, and the cumulative picture is now detailed enough that scholars can speak with genuine confidence about the city's layout, its social geography, and its material culture. What remains genuinely uncertain deserves to be named clearly. The excavation of the Pilgrims' Road produced one of the most striking pieces of physical evidence connecting the city to its own destruction. Several sections of the original Herodian paving were found intact, and some of those stones still bear the deep impact gouges left when Titus's soldiers toppled the upper courses of the temple wall onto the street below in 70 AD. A destruction recorded by Josephus and now readable directly from the ground. The precise population of Jerusalem, particularly at festival time, remains unverifiable from the physical record. Josephus offers figures that most modern scholars consider significantly inflated, and credible scholarly estimates for the permanent population span a wide range. The festival crowd numbers cannot currently be established with confidence. The location of the praetorium where the Gospels place Jesus before Pilate remains actively disputed between two proposed sites, the Antonia Fortress and Herod's Palace on the western ridge, and neither identification can currently be considered established. The interior arrangement of several elements within the temple's inner courts is also debated, with scholars working from the Mishnah's tractate Mido, from Josephus, and from fragmentary physical evidence that does not yet resolve every question. These are not minor details. They sit at the heart of the gospel narrative, and the honest position is that archaeology has not settled them. The Gospels move through Jerusalem at a pace that assumes familiarity. The text does not stop to describe the city because the city did not need description. Its first readers knew it. We don't, or we didn't. The Gospels describe Jesus teaching in the temple courts, performing healings near the city's pools and gates, and moving through roads that tens of thousands of pilgrims were walking alongside him. Archaeology is slowly returning the physical weight of that world. The steps are there. The street surface is there. The ash layer from 70 AD still marks in the earth the precise moment the city ended. But what the stones cannot return is the texture of living inside that tension. The daily negotiation between the sacred and the occupied. The pressure that builds in a city when its deepest convictions and its political reality push in opposite directions, year after year, generation after generation, until something finally gives. Jerusalem in the first century was not simply a holy city. It was a holy city that knew, every single day, that it was being watched. Thank you for being here. This story has been told. Subscribe and return to Bible Stories Unearthed. The book is open. Let's unearth more.